Hi, I'm Ari, I'm the Oak Witch, and in today's video we're going to be going over the differences and similarities between traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft. Many of us know today that there are loads of different types of witchcraft. Some people just have a more generalised, eclectic type of witchcraft. Some people follow a more Wiccan witchcraft, or some people are traditional witches or folk witches, and some people even use the phrase traditional folk witch. But what does that mean? What is the difference between traditional witchcraft and folk witchcraft? That's what I kind of want to have a little chat about today, because I guess I have a view, I have some opinions, and they don't always match up with other people's that I see, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I thought I would get my thoughts and see what you guys think. So a lot of what witchcraft is today is very modern. It might have a lot of ancient or old influences, and I think a lot of these traditional and folk witchcraft practices have formed out of stepping away from Wicca being the mainstream, you know, which I think is great that there's now new paths that people can more readily explore. It's nice that people sort of now are accepting that witchcraft doesn't necessarily have to be solely Gardnerian. Absolutely nothing wrong with traditional Wicca, but I think for a long time it was all that people were exposed to, and not everyone flows with Wicca, so it's nice that there are a bunch of different options. And I think more recently the two parts of witchcraft I see people claiming to and sort of following that path and using these labels is being a traditional witch or being a folk witch, and I think sometimes they are often used interchangeably, and I want to talk about that. I think ultimately it depends on how you look at it, and maybe I just look at it a certain way, but I think there are some similarities for sure, but there are some differences. Traditional witchcraft is quite a broad term, and there's lots of different traditions within this path, which I will talk about later, but it generally reforms to this path of witchcraft that concerns itself with elements of maybe historical European witchcraft and witch lore and folklore, so it generally tends to be a bit more eclectic in its sort of fundamental philosophies when it comes to this idea of traditional witchcraft, but it does have a more bioregional approach, similarly to folk witchcraft, but we'll get on to that in a minute. Within traditional witchcraft you'll see these main traditions such as Andrew Chumbley's sabbatic craft, you'll see the fairy tradition, Robert Cochrane's Clan of Tubal-Cain tradition, and there are some others that stem off of this. So you'll see in traditional witchcraft there does actually tend to be quite a strong presence of these sort of established traditions that have, I guess, their lineages and have their sort of different core philosophies and structures to each path. A lot of these can be group-based or coven-based. They tend to be initiatory in nature and a bit more focused on ritualistic ceremonial aspects alongside a core focus on folk magic and, you know, those traditional customs within this idea of traditional witchcraft. So it's interesting, traditional witchcraft does tend to be a blend of the like folk magic and ceremonial magic ways melded into this kind of different thing entirely. So I tend to see traditional witchcraft in that aspect, whereas folk witchcraft is, again, another really broad term, and it does encompass a lot of different paths, although I wouldn't necessarily say traditions. It's like folk witchcraft is this idea that it is a type of witchcraft that is focused on your local vicinity, relating to a place, a culture, you know. So for example, I am an English folk witch, so my folk witchcraft, my path, the witchcraft that I practice focuses on specifically English folklore, English folk customs, English traditions, sort of my local community, the culture here, everything that ties to the land and the people. That's what my witchcraft tends to draw from and focuses on. The same would be for maybe an Italian folk witch who would focus on Italian folklore, customs, community, people. So it tends to be regional in that aspect, inherently tied to the community, people, and the land in which you are residing, because it relates a lot to, you know, the local spirits. And again, folklore, folk customs is inherently tied to the people, to the common folk. So it is this very regional, local type of witchcraft that doesn't also really have a structure. You know, there aren't really any set traditions. My English folk witchcraft can be really different to someone else who identifies as an English folk witch, especially since I'm from East Anglia, so my English folk witchcraft actually is more East Anglian in nature because that's where I live and have lived all my life. And that can vary really differently from someone else in England, just as I assume for America. You know, so America's huge. There's so many different regions of America, and they'll all vastly differ. So it isn't really this structured, formalized tradition. It is just a type of witchcraft that is labeled according to your region and where you draw from. So there's labels in that sense, but generally speaking, it's highly individualistic. And I think what you'll find with these witchcraft paths is that, you know, they're not really coven based, they're not really ceremonial in its foundations, they don't have these key things that sort of keep the tradition similar according to each path. It just isn't really that, because it is usually very self-made and self-curated, I should say. So it could just look really, really different. An English folk witch might have ceremonial elements in their own path, but that will be entirely self-curated and put there. Whereas people who may go into a traditional witchcraft path or a tradition, they might be in a coven that will do these certain rituals, for example, like the compass round laying the compass, or ceremonial rituals relating to the witch lord and the witch lady, which are these sort of theistic figures that appear in traditions of traditional witchcraft. Not every path, I guess, but they do tend to be quite present in traditional witchcraft, whereas in folk witchcraft, it's not that they don't exist, but they aren't at all any key part of folk witchcraft. Folk witchcraft, I believe, is quite innately animistic, so there is this idea of connecting with spirits, as traditional witchcraft also tends to be quite animistic, but there isn't really any spirits without folk witchcraft, I think, because you're connecting to your local land. It's this idea of plant spirits, land spirits, fairies, you know, and I personally will blend my English folk witchcraft with Brittonic polytheism, so the deities of England where I live. So for me that's very interconnected, but that's again self-curated. So it is interesting to see that both may be very spirit-based, but traditional witchcraft can be a bit more formulaic, whereas folk witchcraft in general is just very like anything goes, but also it's specific to your region and your culture, your land that you live on, etc, etc. So going back to this idea of being bioregional, folk witchcraft is innately animistic and bioregional. It is just entirely focused on your surroundings, and I think I see a lot of people use this term folk magic as a really broad thing. Oh, I'm practicing folk magic, but there are folk magical practices which are seen across the entire world, like the use of horseshoes as a protective measure. You see that in Britain, you can see that in the United States, you can see that in mainland European countries. It's not a practice that's really specific to one region only, so people may label that as just like a folk practice, using horseshoes as a protective measure, but it's still something that is tied to your local customs as to why they would use that for protection, if that makes sense. So folk magic as a singular sort of homogenous thing, I don't think really exists. I think that people sort of mistake these like broad practices as something that's just folk magic. I believe folk magic, and as a consequentially folk witchcraft, is inherently tied to a culture, a region, a locality, you know, the common folk. If you know, going back to stripping down what folk means, what it refers to the people, your community, your local land. All these things I think you can't really take out of folk magic. So yeah, I think it just going back, traditional witchcraft can be quite broad as a tradition that anyone can sort of adopt from anywhere without it necessarily having to be tied to your land, your community. Obviously it can have those elements because it does focus on aspects like bioregionalism and folk magic. Those are core components of traditional witchcraft, and a traditional witch's practice can be entirely, you know, based in their vicinity, locality and all those things. But I think there are still elements which tend to be formulaic in a structured path that I think people can sort of adopt and absorb without it necessarily being tied to a specific region. So laying the compass as a ritual is something that traditional witches employ, which isn't necessarily tied to a folk magical tradition, like a local custom. It's just something that is broadly accepted as a part of traditional witchcraft practices. Generally, on the whole, if someone says to you traditional witchcraft, you can kind of have an idea of what that looks like. Whereas if you just say folk witchcraft, I'm like, okay, but what folk witchcraft? Where? From where? You know? I hope that makes any sense. This is just what's going on in my brain. I see it a lot because I see a lot of people sort of calling themselves traditional folk witch. I'm not saying that obviously you can employ the both together and they can really blend quite well, and I'm not trying to invalidate that label at all. I just thought it'd be nice to have a discussion about maybe like seeing them as individual paths as well. So overall I think similarities, both paths tend to be quite animistic, both quite bioregional, and they both are a lot more folk magic centered as opposed to ceremonial. The differences I think which tend to make them slightly more distinct paths is that traditional witchcraft does have a lot more ceremonial elements, whereas folk witchcraft barely has any inherently tied to the structure of this idea of folk witchcraft. That's not me saying that there are no ceremonial elements. It's something that may be incorporated into a folk witchcraft practice, but that would be something self-curated. Another difference is many of these traditional witchcraft paths can be initiatory and coven based, whereas folk witchcraft tends to be a lot more solitary. It's very individualistic, and there isn't really any group initiations inherently tied to the structure of what it means to be a folk witch, because it is again a self-curated individualistic practice based on your local regional customs, folklore, community, and there may be like local covens that folk witches practice, but I don't think it's something that's as common as you'll see in traditional witchcraft practices. So again, traditional witchcraft I think tends to be a bit more structured, whereas folk witchcraft is a lot more individualistic and personable. Another difference I said before is that traditional witchcraft tends to be more duotheistic in nature, or at the very least it will have this idea of like the witch lord or the folkloric devil, and folk witchcraft can have this, but it's not inherently tied to the structure of the path. While traditional witchcraft can be bioregional and usually is very bioregional, folk witchcraft is distinctively and innately tied to your local land, your local spirits. So it is, bioregionalism is like a core foundational aspect of folk witchcraft. So yeah, those are kind of like my ideas for how it works. If you disagree, please let me know. I would love to have a conversation about this down below. Again, this is not me saying that this is what everyone should think. I'm just spilling thoughts out of my brain, I guess. And I would like to know people's thoughts. I'd like to know if you identify as a traditional folk witch, what that means to you, and maybe we can educate each other and talk about it a little bit more, because yeah, I don't know. I don't mind having my mind changed, but this is what's just on my brain. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for my members who are supporting this channel currently. It really, really helps, and I really appreciate you. And yeah, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.